Anguish over the nature crisis and the government's environment record blew up in politics this week as the climate minister and international envoy Zac Goldsmith resigned from the cabinet. It came after he was criticised by the Commons Privileges Committee in its report on Boris Johnson. But his resignation letter makes clear that he stood down because of anger over the government's environment policies, and it is a furious dispatch. Here are just some of the pointed phrases. The UK has visibly stepped off the world stage and withdrawn our leadership on climate and nature. Then, this government's apathy in the face of the greatest challenge we have faced makes continuing in my current role untenable. And most pointedly for Rishi Sunak, the problem is not that the government is hostile to the environment, it is that you, our Prime Minister, are simply uninterested. Well, to get some reaction to that, here are the thoughts of our energy and climate correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter, who was at an event that Zac Goldsmith was expected to attend.
It's not so much, I suppose, the resignation of Lord Goldsmith that is surprising. He's obviously a man under a degree of political pressure, but the manner of his resignation, the language he used is really quite striking, full of contempt and dismay. He says that the Prime Minister is uninterested in environmental issues, personally unmoved. Now that kind of language, the contempt involved in it, really adds to this drumbeat for me of criticism of this government, that it has started to deprioritise climate change as an issue by approving new oil and gas licences, for example. We've had that recent criticism from the Climate Change Committee that the government is way off track in meeting its net zero targets. And there has been additional criticism that actually what's happening is the government has made a political choice not to prioritise climate change, not to be seen to be preaching on this issue or meddling with people's lives too much when it comes to things like electric vehicles or heat pumps. And I suppose there's a widening gap now, and Zac Goldsmith's language and resignation only adds to that sense between the grand promises that were made under Boris Johnson and this government's actual plans to deliver them.
Lord Goldsmith's scathing resignation comes in the same week as the annual progress report from the government's climate watchdog. And it wasn't pretty. It said it was markedly less confident than a year ago that the UK would reach its legally binding emissions reduction targets. Across a mammoth 451 pages, the Climate Change Committee found that the government has lost its global leadership on the climate and backtracked on fossil fuel commitments with a tranche of new coal, oil and gas approvals. Been too slow to react to green investment in the US and the EU, creating a strong pull for green investment away from the UK. Has no coherent programme to encourage people to change to lower carbon behaviours. Has no clear policy to decarbonise heavy industries. Insulated fewer homes than the year before, despite higher energy costs. And is well off track on its target for heat pump installations, with Britain sitting bottom of the pile per capita across the whole of Europe. And the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee joins me now. That's Chris Stark. Chris, just a few weeks ago we had Grant Shapps on the programme. We talked about this government having an unrivalled record of decarbonising. You're painting a very different picture.
We are painting a different picture. I think we can look back and see quite a strong record of progress. And it's been very notable that ministers have been doing a lot of retrospection recently about how good things have been, how many targets have been met. That's not really what this report's about. So we've been looking out to 2030 and beyond. 2030 is, you might recall, the date that we set these very ambitious targets for just 18 months ago in Glasgow at the Climate Summit. Just 7 years away now. And we think if you look outside of the areas where the government has been putting real effort into it, and if you look at the outside of the power sector in particular, good story on power, of course, but outside of the power sector, we think we need a quadrupling of the progress that we see in other parts of the economy to hit that 2030 goal. So, bright past, slightly dismal future at the moment. Well, no, I think dismal is probably not the right word. I'm just very worried about that 2030 goal. And it's not just 2030, it takes you on, of course, beyond that. And we just don't see in this very detailed programme now that we've got from the government the kind of ambition that would take us to those 2030 goals.
You yourself say we are going to need some fossil fuels in the mix to take us 2030 and beyond. I mean, Grant Shapps makes the point that it's better that they come from here, so maybe we ought to allow a bit more new drilling. What do you make of that?
I mean, what's been really striking in the last year is that we've got a set of ministers notionally working on climate change who seem to have been talking more about oil and gas than anything else. And you definitely see that with Grant Shapps, with Graham Stewart. No doubt there is room for some extra oil and gas production, particularly gas. You know, I can accept the arguments that in the middle of an energy crisis like this, that if there is some way to extract more gas, that would be useful.
Although it just goes on to the international market.
It does, and that's the challenge, really. So we're not short of oil. Gas is definitely more of a challenge, but we don't have any way of mandating that it comes to the UK, short of nationalising those companies, and I'm not aware that that's a Grant Shapps policy. So I think we need to focus on the real challenge here, which is reducing our demand for the stuff in the first place.
So does all this mean you're hoping for a Labour win in the next general election?
You will never get that from me. I mean, I'm very interested to see what happens at the next general election, but I don't think we need a change of government to see a change in plan. There's a point nestling behind this. I get the feeling that a lot of people are looking now to the next general election as the point when we might change the story on climate. That's just too late. So, you know, if we have to wait another year without progress in some of these critical issues, we are definitely going to miss that 2030 goal. 7 years is you know, simply too short a period to have another wasted year.
Just a broader one. It seems to me that we've moved from a position 18 months ago around the time of the Glasgow COP, where within politics people were competing to do more on climate. We've almost got to the reverse of that, with Labour backing away from their firm investment plans. As you say, the government basically saying very little on climate. Do you read that rather sort of depressing momentum in the wrong direction?
I'm afraid I think I do. One of the things I've done this week is go back to the work that we produced around the time of COP26, and you can tell from the papers we were producing, the reports we were producing, there's just more enthusiasm for everything. And it does feel like that now. I've been talking about the present situation is that you've got this kind of really odd situation. You've got this massive programme of work now happening in government, massive, you know, across the whole of government. But it is an exercise collectively in pushing pieces of string, unless there's someone at the top pulling that string taut. And it feels like that's absent now. And you know, that discussion of this opportunity of getting to net zero has really exited the scene. And I think that's the thing that we need to see back.
When it comes to climate, do you miss Boris Johnson?
There are many bits with Boris Johnson's time that I do not miss. I certainly do miss the strong rhetorical support that he provided for net zero. You don't need Boris Johnson for that, though. Yeah, any leader of any government, and it's not just in this country, should feel able to talk about net zero in those terms. That, it seems to me, is something you could put right very quickly. But
it matters. That kind of rhetoric from the top matters as well, doesn't it? I mean, sure, the policies matter, but that kind of enthusiasm in that direction matters.
Yeah, something I'm asked a lot about, and often, is, you know, what structure in government could you create that would make it more likely they'll deliver? And the answer I quite often give is, well, you can invent these things, but it only works when you know that the person at the top wants it. And that's, you know, generally what was happening during the Boris Johnson era. I don't imagine that Boris Johnson was looking over Gantt charts of progress and delivery plans. But you need someone who's willing to talk about it, and then the civil servants and the people working on these issues know where they stand on it. And so does, you know, people around the cabinet table. They know what to do. And, you know, just a bit of that, you know, clear support, enthusiastic support would help, I think, at the moment.
I saw a report out this week saying China looked like it was going to reach some of its goals in terms of clean energy generation 5 years early. I mean, we seem to be in a world where China is now showing the leadership and we're not. It's kind of embarrassing.
We reflect on just that very thing in our report. Now, in the last 12 months, lots of things have happened in the world. Obviously, the Ukrainian crisis is driving a lot of the story on climate at the moment. We in this country also had the Conservative Party leadership election at that time, and I feel that British politics looked inwards rather than outwards. Over that period, the US did the Inflation Reduction Act, massive step forward on climate policy. Lots of debate about whether it will work or not, but they did it. The EU response to that is also massive. If you look to China, they are putting more renewables in the ground than ever before. It is by some distance the bit of the world that's doing the most investment in renewables now. We haven't really noticed any of that, and I think we imagine sometimes that we're not existing in a world that is interconnected with these things, there is a real risk that we'll fall behind on this and that the pace of change in this country will be slower than those other places.
So for climate optimism, we have to look beyond our own shores.
I agree. So I think we need to be part of that global community on climate, and that means trying to follow when you see these big steps forward.
Thanks very much, Chris. Time for a break now, and when we come back, we'll be at the Glastonbury of farming, looking at how you can still grow a lot of food whilst looking after nature too.